very happy to be here today. I apologize for making you come on a Sunday. That's not very nice. But I think it will be worth having a bit of time to see each other, talk to each other, and through that, understand each other a little bit more. So, this time of turbulence is interesting because it is reminding us how connected we are. Globalization that we have built along these last decades, especially after the fall of the Berlin Wall, has led to an enormous connectivity and connection between our economies, but also between our societies. This globalization was built essentially following it had four characteristics. Characteristic number one of this globalization was that openness was the default option. If we had to choose, we would choose openness. Of course, we knew that sometimes we had to modulate openness because there were safety or security or environmental considerations, but the main approach was to open. The second characteristic of this globalization was that markets had the upper hand over states. Of course, every country was a little bit different. In Europe, for example, states still had a big role to play in providing for social safety nets. But the rule was that the economy was managed by markets, by businesses, not by states. The third characteristic was that we had one big organization, one big tent called the World Trade Organization, and everybody fitted under this big tent. China fitted, and Taipei fitted. Russia fitted, and Ukraine fitted. Saudi Arabia fitted, and Vietnam fitted. The idea was that we had one system of rules and that everybody would converge their trade policies to sit under this one roof. The fourth element was that the laws of economics trumped geopolitics. I've been in the last 25 years, I've had many lives, but I had a very long one as a trade negotiator. And I can tell you that when the security people would come and would want to have a say, we would brush them aside and we would say, it's all about economics. So please, get away. This is what this last 3 decades has been about. And this is what has generated incredible amounts of growth, of jobs, of prosperity. And in a country like this one in China, this is also how millions have exited poverty. Now, it's fair to say that these 4 characteristics have seen a gradual erosion lately. The first erosion started in quite a sharp way in 2008 with the 2008 financial crisis, when it became clear that you could not have openness without rules of the game. This was particularly clear in the financial sector, which was a very open sector, but in many parts of the world, and in particular in one, which is where the crisis started, in the US, the rules of the game were not strong enough. And as a result of that, a huge financial crisis erupted that transformed into an economic crisis that took global proportions. I remember this 2008 very well because this is the beginning when we started to have doubts about the system. I remember very well sitting in the G20 London summit in April 2009, and I remember very well hearing the Chinese president at the time, Hu Jintao, saying China will keep its markets open. And I remember very well how China keeping its markets open sent a very strong signal to countries not to embark in protectionist policies and helped us exit those crises faster than we would have anticipated. I also remember that this was the time when China took a big stimulus package that helped this country weather the 2008 crisis very strongly. But it was this same stimulus package that saw the seeds of the housing bubble that we have seen developed over these last years. After 2008, and in many parts of the world where the exit to the crisis was a very unequal one, we also faced very sharp concerns about rising inequalities. Thus is the second big question mark of this globalization that we built over the last decades, that the benefits of this wealth creation, the benefits of the growth, the benefits of the jobs were not equally distributed. That some had a lot and amassed even more, but many were left behind. And there we started to see problems with legitimacy of open markets, because in many parts of the world started to complain that maybe open markets were not deriving as many benefits as they wanted to from open markets. Then we saw the rise of the concerns about climate change, with many starting to question whether the form of globalization we had built was compatible with the response we have to give to this existential threat that has become climate change. And this questioning continues, mostly driven by people like you, the young generation, because at the end of the day, climate change is a huge intergenerational issue. What we do or don't do today is the world that you will live in your next lifetimes. So this third concern, climate change, became also a big question mark over the type of globalization we were building. Then came a president in the US, Donald Trump, that started to use national security to modulate trade opening. A national security that until then was capital N, capital S, so real big security, the threats to a country, anything became national security. Steel became national security, aluminum became national security, vehicles became national security. Basically, national security became another name for economic competitiveness. But again, this was another erosion of these four principles that I have mentioned at the beginning of this conversation. Then came COVID, and then came Russia's invasion of Ukraine, and then came concerns that there were sectors where there was probably over-reliance on a very small handful of suppliers, and concerns that there were too many risks in the management of certain sectors like healthcare or like energy. That became apparent. And then, as if this was not enough, we have a huge China-US rivalry, a rivalry that is very much centered on technology. This is why technology has become this flashpoint. And when one talks about technology, obviously, one is not only thinking about the economic use of technology, but also the military and defense use of technology. So basically, little by little, since 2008, we've been moving slowly into a questioning of globalization, where these four characteristics that I've mentioned at the beginning are being modulated. There are sectors where closeness is now the default option. This is clearly the case for technology. This is clearly the case for technology which has a military use. This is what some have called a small field with a very high fence. This has become a sector, this is becoming a sector excluded from globalization. We are also seeing the return of the states with a lot of force, and states taking the upper hand over markets. Of course, the climate transition, the transformation of the energy sector, the technological transition require big public investments too. Let's face it. The task is so phenomenal that we need states to invest. But how states will invest will matter a lot to what kind of spillover effects we will see from certain countries on other countries. This is what we see today with the Inflation Reduction Act. This is what some also fear about the European Union CBAM approach. Unilateral responses to climate change, they run the risk of creating a spillover effect for other actors. The third is that there are questions about whether everyone fits under one roof. And actually what we start to see is the possibility, the risk, that we fragment the playing field into competing regulatory frameworks, with the risk that this will pose for inflation, because at the end of the day, what this has as an impact is inflationary impact. Finally, geopolitics are back with a vengeance. These colleagues that I was pushing 30 years back into the corner, they are now taking the center stage. And they want geopolitics to have a greater say over the laws of economics. So what do we do? This is the big question that we are all asking ourselves. What can we do given the circumstances? I think our big task is to define how we will manage our coexistence. Maybe we are not going to be converging, but we're going to have to live in the same planet. And we better learn to manage this economic coexistence, preventing our differences in the area of trade and economics from turning into outright trade conflicts or trade wars. So for that, I think we have to be very clear that we will have to cooperate on international public goods, that we cannot allow the fragmentation to fragment our commitment to global public goods. And frankly, this is a bit what I am seeing if I observe closely what's happening internationally. I can see all members of the international community agreed last year to endorse a framework to protect biodiversity. This is also what I saw last year in the World Trade Organization with a big agreement on reducing subsidies that contribute to overfishing. This is also what I've seen with a new framework on the law of the seas. This indicates that we have to push in this space that has to do with protecting global public goods. I think we have to make a big effort to encapsulate military rivalry. We need to be able to define some guardrails, starting with some sort of short-term confidence-building measures, which is why I'm looking with a lot of trepidation to the upcoming meeting between US President Joe Biden and Chinese President Xi Jinping, because I think it is important to be very conscious that this rivalry on the military side has to be encapsulated. Fourthly, I think we have to use extensively international organizations, and in particular the World Trade Organization. Maybe they will not be fostering convergence, but they will help us manage the coexistence. These are spaces that can help us absorb the shocks that come with competing systems. They will help us in providing a platform where we have to rationalize the arguments we use to defend our own specificities. So we have to use much more international organization and use them also to define guardrails. I hope that the upcoming ministerial conference of the WTO next year, beginning of next year, moves forward on defining guardrails on subsidies, on national security, on the link between trade and climate change, and on dispute settlement. And it's good that we discuss about dispute settlement, given that here we are in the house of arbitration. We need the arbitration capacity of the World Trade Organization to be back. Finally, I think if there is one thing we need to understand is that countries will not have legitimacy from their citizens to keep markets open if they do not invest in social safety nets at home. This is the very clear lesson that whether we are living in Europe, whether we're living in China, whether we're living in the US, wherever we are living, as citizens, we will not lend our support for open markets if the social safety nets are not strengthened. Especially now that we are seeing technology in the form of artificial intelligence become yet another disruptor of our labor market and become, therefore, yet another more reason why we need to strengthen social safety nets, whether it's education, whether it's healthcare, whether it is pensions, whether it is working conditions, whether it's taxation policies, all of this needs to be strengthened wherever we are, because this will be the guarantee for citizens that governments can continue to nurture a new form of globalization that helps us in managing our interconnectedness, this incredible interdependence that we have built over the last 30 years. So this is what I wanted to put to you to begin this conversation, but obviously now I'm in the hands of Wu Chen, and I'm sure that he's going to be incisive and question a number of things that I have put to you for your consideration. Thank you very much.